In Bosnia and Herzegovina here in part 3. Probably most likely it's going to be the last part of the edition. And friends, we've got a lot to state over, a lot of history. And let's get underway. Remember, I recommend everyone to watch over the previous 2 parts we have done already and making fantastic progress. And remember, we have already recorded about over 40 countries at the moment here on this series, which is a staggering, as I say, achievement in of itself. So now let's explore more with regards to more of the recent history. And we didn't really speak much about socialist Yugoslavia. The Jewish community of Bosnia and Herzegovina was reconstituted after the Holocaust, but most survivors would choose to emigrate to Israel. The community would come under, let's say, the auspices of the Federation of the Jewish Communities in Yugoslavia, which was based in Belgrade at that stage in time. Now, there were many Jewish personalities there, which would remain prominent in Sarajevo. They would remain prominent in socialist Bosnia and Herzegovina. Someone named Svetko Ritman was the first director of the, let's say, Sarajevo Opera. This was, I think, between 1946 and 1947, after the war. I think he would have a son, Ranko, who would later be part of a rock band in Sarajevo, in Dexi. There was someone named Oscar Danon, who would achieve fame as a composer and the conductor during the Yugoslav times. Ernest Grin was one of the leading Yugoslav medical doctors and a member of the Bosnian and Herzegovinian Academy of Sciences and Arts. Then there was someone named Emmerich Blum, who was a founder of the Energijornivist, and I think was Sarajevo's mayor between 1981 to 1983, and a member also of the organization committee of the 1984 Winter Olympics. So he was another, let's say, key, like, worldly figure in Sarajevo of that window of time. And I think also someone named Ivan Kirsniges was active as an architect. He actually restored Jewish buildings and sites, including the Ashkenazic synagogue. I think the Kalinovo temple happened to be, and the 16th century old Jewish cemetery that was in Sarajevo. Let's just say whose project was slated to present 24 hours before the war broke out, I think in March 1992, which we very much spoke about before. Now, in the early 1990s, before there was the Yugoslav wars, the Jewish population of Bosnia and Herzegovina was 2,000, which wasn't that many people, and there was relations between the Jewish people and the Catholic and Orthodox and Muslim neighbours at that seeming time was quite good. So remember, we spoke about how there was good interfaith relations between the countries in various stages at times. That's something we very much pointed out in yesterday's class. Now, the Jewish community was headed of Bosnia and Herzegovina by Ivan Kresniges, I think from 1992 until his emigration to Israel in 1996. His tenure itself would coincide with the Bosnian War, I think, of 1992 to 1995. I think there was obviously the besieging Serb army. They would occupy the Jewish cemetery in Sarajevo, from where they sniped on the city. I think Kresniges would give permission in the army of the Republic of Bosnia and Serbia to target the cemetery. The Sarajevan Jewish Humanitarian Society was something called the La Benevolencia, which would provide aid to thousands of besieged Sarajevo residents at that stage in time. It would supply food, medicine, postal and radio communications. I think this president, let's say himself, Kresniges, told a local paper that the non-sectarian relief effort was partly a gesture of gratitude to local Muslims who had hidden Jews during the Nazi occupation of Yugoslavia. You can see how by doing good acts it does get repaid over. So we see that at that point in time they were actually good for the Jewish community in of itself. And then after the war started, this La Benevolencia would assist the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee in the evacuation of 2,500 Sarajevo residents, only 1/3 of whom were Jewish at that point in time. There were 11 evacuations in all, 3 by air early on in the war, and 8 by bus convoy after the airports had been closed to civilian traffic, while other convoys were stopped. The Kresniges convoys all got through. as, let's say, at that point in time, there was field staff from the joint negotiated ceasefires to ensure safe transfer. In 1997, the Jewish population of Bosnia was only 600 people. About half were living in Sarajevo. Remember, Sarajevo was a concentration place, most of whom had fled Sarajevo and Bosnia and chose to remain in Israel after the wars had ended. Some would also return, and others moved elsewhere, such as a place called Robert Rothbart. Very interesting. So let's talk a bit about independent Bosnia and Herzegovina. Obviously, the Jewish community in Bosnia has been led by Jacob Finke since the year 1995. We'll speak about him more towards the end. The Constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina reserves, I think, top political positions, including membership of the Presidency and House of the Peoples, to members of the three constituent peoples, Bosniaks, Croats and Serbs. I think it was in the year 2009 the European Court of Human Rights was established in the Sejic and Finke, Bosnia and Herzegovina, ruling that the country's constitution will actually violate, if I'm not mistaken, the European Convention on Human Rights. That was reported over here on Wikipedia. There was an agreement, I believe, between the political parties to amend this constitution. Accordingly, I think it's still pending, to show the updates in regards to that. Notwithstanding, obviously there was international pressure. And this didn't, let's say, prevent Bosnian Jews from achieving great positions. Among them, I think, let's say, Sven Alkali. Remember, the Alkali family is the one. He would become the Minister of Foreign Affairs between the years 2007 to 2012. And I think it was in the year 2024, Jews and Muslims from Bosnia and Herzegovina jointly observed the International Holocaust Remembrance Day to facilitate, let's say, dialogue and respect in response to the Gaza war. So that was that one. Obviously, you can see there was a more unified structure. That's something that we very much have to talk about here. Now, we talked about the Sarajevo Haggadah. I believe we talked about it on yesterday's class. Let's just talk about it now again. Or let's go on. There was a Sarajevo Haggadah from the 14th century. So what was that, friends? So the Sarajevo Haggadah is a 14th century illuminated manuscript which survived many close calls with destruction. Historians believe that it was taken out of Spain by Spanish Jews who were expelled by the Inquisition in 1492. I think there's notes in various margins of this Haggadah, if I'm not mistaken. It indicates that it surfaced in Italy in the 16th century, and it was sold, I believe, to the National Museum in Sarajevo in 1894 by a man of the name Joseph Cohen. I think it was during the Second World War. The manuscript was hidden from the Nazis by someone named Dr. Jozo Petrovic, and he was the director of the City Museum, and by Dervis Kurkut, the chief librarian who smuggled the Haggadah out to a Muslim clerk in a mountain village near Treskavikia, where it was hidden in the mosque among Korans and other Islamic texts. And I think it was during the Bosnian War between 1992 to 1995, when Sarajevo was under constant siege by Bosnian Serb forces. The manuscript would survive in an underground bank vault. Afterwards, the manuscript was restored at that point in time through a special campaign that was financed by the United Nations and the Bosnian Jewish community. I think that was in the year 2001, if I'm not mistaken. And it will go eventually on permanent display at the museum in December 2002, a while later on. We're going to explore more of the synagogues in a few minutes, but we know the oldest synagogues in Bosnia and Herzegovina was obviously built by the Sephardic community in the 16th century, because they were the first people there. During the Austro-Hungarian period, the new Ashkenazic community also built synagogues, often adopting a more Moorish revival architectural style, as obviously in Sarajevo's Ashkenazic synagogue. Most of them, unfortunately, was destroyed during World War II, including Sarajevo's second Cal Grand. I believe today there are 4 synagogues that... I'm okay. Yeah, thanks. I think, thank you very much, thanks. I think 4 synagogues remain in Sarajevo today. There's an Old Temple, which happens to be a Sephardic synagogue, with a large inn named the Great Courtyard, is known to have been built all the way back in 1581 with the donation of the Turkish Beylerbey Jamush Pasha to help the poor members, let's say, of the Jewish community in Sarajevo. I think it would endure two different fires in 1697 and also in 1768. And I think, let's say, the synagogue's current look stems from the restoration reservations in the year 1821, and it serves as a Jewish museum. There's what's called the New Temple, built alongside with the Old Temple. Today it serves as an art gallery owned by the Jewish community of Sarajevo. And then there is also the Bjilaba Synagogue, Kal di la Bilaba. I think it was during the Second World War. The building was confiscated by the Ustase and was used as a detention facility. And then there's the Ashkenazic Synagogue, which was actually designed by someone called Karel Patrick, which was built in 1902. And obviously at that point in time there was very much a growing Ashkenazic community, especially, once again, this was done in the Moorish revival architectural style in of itself. We're going to speak more about the synagogues in due course. Let's speak about the Jewish municipality of Sarajevo here. And now anyone that you're tuning in live at the moment, welcome to our community. And don't forget, at the moment, if you're new here, subscribe to the channel. We want to get to Tu B'Shvat with 8,500 subscribers. Let's see if we can reach that brilliant achievement over here. Okay, the Jewish municipality of Sarajevo, what was that? So it also served the Jewish community of Sarajevo. It was a religious organization of citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina of Jewish origin with a seat in Sarajevo. The history of Jewish immigration to Bosnia and Herzegovina and Sarajevo, obviously, as we mentioned about in the first part, began in 1492 after the Spanish Catholic state under Ferdinand and Isabella managed to break the power of the Muslim rulers in Spain. And for the remaining citizens of the Muslim and Jewish faiths, it was a time of discrimination and pressure to accept Christianity or leave, let's just say, had begun. At that moment, the Ottoman government allowed Jewish exiles from Spain to settle in the territory. I think it was around the year 1551, the first Jewish families moved to Sarajevo, as we talked about before, and as early as 1565, a Jewish municipality, a Sephardic one, was founded in Sarajevo at the request of the Muslim leaders of Sarajevo. Someone named Kinjel Stavros Pasha, he would arrive in Sarajevo in 1581. He built a large inn as apartments for Jewish people in order to live as a special people in the city. And I think at that point in time, the Ottoman government did not impose on the Jews the ghetto provisions first established by the Christian rulers. And Stavros Pasha managed to get permission from the Sultan for the Jews of Sarajevo to build their own synagogues over there. So that's interesting. There was a Jewish community also in Doboj in the history itself. We didn't really speak much about it. I think in the rest of the country, some synagogues buildings may have preserved and renovated, such as in an area called Doboj. Interesting enough, I think they would actually host some various different services. There was a history of Jews in Banja Luka also in Bosnia. Sephardi Jews were first mentioned in Banja Luka, I think back in the 16th century. Until the Austro-Hungarian time, the Jewish population of Banja Luka was exclusively, at that point in time, of Sephardic Jews originating from Spain and Portugal. They were into crafts and trade. Crafts obviously practiced by the poorer Jews, you could say, or the ones less well off. Well, those somewhat, let's say, more financially better off, were into trade over there. I think since 1878, the Jewish people obviously gave great impetus expansion of the capitalist economy and the spread of Western European ideals in Banja Luka. And I think there's some data from between years 1815 to 1878 where there's holders of import-export trade were Serbians, they were Jewish people and Muslims, and were orientated towards the initial trade and handicraft, if I'm not mistaken. As we stated before, the Ashkenazic community would start to settle in the 19th century. Before World War II, Banja Luka's Jewish community consisted of a few hundred Jewish families. They were, let's say, at that point in time, nearly all wiped out, sadly, during the Holocaust in Yugoslavia. And today, the number of Jewish families in Banja Luka are in the tens, if I'm not mistaken. And there's a Jewish culture center, Mari Livna, which was opened in Banja Luka quite recently in the year 2015. Now, we spoke about the Jewish cemeteries yesterday. Let's just recap a little bit within regards to it. There's an old Jewish cemetery of Sarajevo. There's a Rogatica Jewish cemetery, which was established in 1900, hosting 16 tombstones. 10 others probably older, let's just say. There's stones sunk in the ground. There's, let's say, tombs hold inscriptions in Hebrew, Ladino, in Serbo-Croatian, if I'm not mistaken. And there's a memorial, I think, of victims in the Second World War. And that's where the burial site of Rabbi Moshe Danon in Stolac in 1832. We've got to look at the Sarajevo Megillah, which was restored by Ivan Krasinjus in the years 1990-1991, which you very much have to point out over here. Let's explore a bit with regards to the synagogue. I think we did record a video on the history of some of the synagogues, if I recollect, a few months ago we did. Now let's talk about briefly the main synagogues over here. There was a Il Calgrande. What was that? That was also spelled Calgrandi in Judeo-Spanish. It's a former, let's say, Orthodox synagogue located in Sarajevo. It was a Sephardi synagogue and has been a cultural center since the year 1946. I think it was constructed once again in Moorish revival in 1930 by a designer of the architect, someone named Rudolf Lubinsky. I think it was the largest and most ornate synagogue in the Balkans. It included a large ornately decorated prayer hall, a small prayer hall, more Beit Midrash, for use during the week. There's a geniza there, there's rooms for the rabbi, and various other utilities. Since the building was meant to serve not only as a synagogue, but also as a community center. And the building was consecrated in 1930 in a ceremony that was actually attended by the famous chief rabbi of Yugoslavia, Rabbi Dr. Isaac Alcala, who we'll speak about in due course, and also the chief Sephardic rabbi at the time of Sarajevo, Rabbi Dr. Moritz Levy, and Ashkenazic chief rabbi at the time came, Rabbi Dr. Hinko Orbach, among others. So that was a famous site in of its own right. I have to point out the building was heavily damaged and looted by the Nazis in 1941. And the majority of the Jewish community, unfortunately, were murdered in the terrible Holocaust. After World War II, all the Jews of Sarajevo used the Sarajevo synagogue, the synagogue of the Ashkenazi community, if I'm not mistaken. And I think in 1946, the Jewish community reached an agreement with the city's new government to donate a building in the city of Sarajevo and to be used exclusively for cultural purpose. The exterior of the Il Calgrande was restored in a simplified secular form in 1965, and the former dome was replaced with a flat roof. The building was initially used by Duro Dakovic Workers' University Center and currently as a Bosnian cultural center, I believe, over there. Let's explore what are the other synagogues there. The Sarajevo synagogue, we know that was built in 1902, designed in Moorish style. We can explore a few more synagogues in a minute. The old synagogue Kal Vijezu, that was actually built in the year 1580. It's the first synagogue in Bosnia, obviously hosting the museum nowadays. The Ilkan Grand, which we just spoke about, in 1930, which I think, very, very interesting enough. I think the Bosnian Cultural Center was opened up in 1993 there. The Ilkan Nuovo, this was in Sarajevo, I think in the year 1870, and built next to the old synagogue, if I'm not mistaken. The Ilkan de la Bilava, this was built in 1900 in Sarajevo. I think it happens to be an apartment building today. The Ilkan, then there's a Zenica synagogue, which has been since 1903 in Zenica. I think it's been used as a museum since 1968. The Doboj synagogue, I think in 1922, and it was consecrated in 2003. The synagogue is reconstructed house of Alexander Rikosi and Otto Kalama. It's officially named the Bet Shalom synagogue, if I'm not mistaken. Then the old Dojob synagogue, which I think was built in 1874, I think was destroyed in 1941. Only the doors of this synagogue would survive and are kept in the new, which was opened in 2003. Then there's a Weissgrad synagogue, which was built in 1904. I think it's currently the local Red Cross headquarters. The Mostar synagogue was built in 1904. Once again, this was heavily damaged, but this time in the Bosnian War, and renovated in 1996. It hosts Mostar Puppet Theatre now. So you can see how it changed. Then the Travnik synagogue was built in 1863. I think it was replaced. It replaced a wooden temple built in 1840. It was demolished in 2008. The Zepka synagogue was built in 1903. The Grachsanisa synagogue built in 1890. The Virginia synagogue was in 1901, if I'm not mistaken, over there. And then there's there's Bihak synagogue, which was built in 1904. till 1950. The Deventer Synagogue was 1911 to 1950. Once again, this was heavily damaged by Eustace in 1941, and the remnants would collapse in 1950. The Rogatika Synagogue was built in 1928. It stands, I think, still, but in ruins. The new temple in Banja Luka was built in 1937, I think, till 1944. It was actually consecrated by the chief rabbi of Yugoslavia, Rabbi Dr. Isaac Alcala. The first Sephardic synagogue in Banja Luka was between 1870 to 1878. It was lost because of a fire. There was other synagogues. The second Sephardic synagogue in 1880 in Banja Luka. And the third Sephardic synagogue in Banja Luka. There was Ari Levi Jewish Culture Center, which is in Banja Luka, I think, since the year 2014, if I'm not mistaken. That's also interesting enough. And there's also the Visoko Synagogue from 1886. The Tuzio Synagogue from 1936. I think it's currently used as a dry cleaner. So the Stolak Synagogue from 1832 and the Zvornik Synagogue from 1902. I'm reading this from Wikipedia over here. They've got like an illustrative list. So what was a Sarajevo synagogue, friends, over here? The Sarajevo Synagogue was an Orthodox synagogue. And I think it was located on the south bank of the river of Mijaka in Sarajevo. And in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the synagogue, I think, was constructed as in 1902, and it's the only functioning synagogue in Sarajevo today, apparently. It's an Ashkenazic synagogue, if I'm not mistaken. Now, we've spoken in detail about the history of the Sarajevan community in itself. We mentioned about, I don't know if I mentioned at the beginning, that many of the Jewish settlers to Sarajevo would actually come via Salonika at this point in time. And we mentioned about before that they were merchants, pharmacists, doctors. And just to go back a bit, obviously with the permission of the Pasha at Slavush in 1577, they would establish their own headquarters known as El Cortijo. And in 1580, the community, with the assistance of the Turkish benefactor, who built a synagogue in El Cortijo within a building called the Velika Abidja, if I'm not mistaken. And we spoke about this in some detail before. The building, I think, will burn in 1679 and 1778. It was rebuilt each time, we have to point out over here. The Ashkenazic Jews, as we mentioned before, would arrive in Sarajevo around in 1878, and by the following year, enough Ashkenazim would arrive to make an association, and the first chief rabbi of the Ashkenazic community over there was someone named Rabbi Bernard Buchwald, and land was purchased in 1893 with the help of H. Levy. They began to construct their own synagogue in 1895. There was an original draft, I think, made by the Austrian Jewish architect Wilhelm Slancy, who, let's say, designed a synagogue in Vienna and Prague. Slancy promoted the Moorish revival style, but his purpose, I think, was rejected originally by the provincial government. There were changes made at his request, incorporated in the final design by Czech architect Karel Patik, if I'm not mistaken. And in 1902, a 4-story synagogue was dedicated, and Ashkenazic population at that point in time was 1,400 people. And we talked about how the Sephardic community would construct their own Il Grande synagogue over there in 1932, and it was the largest and most ornate synagogues in the Balkans. Obviously, there was devastation by the Nazis in 1941, and that's something we've already spoken about before. Let's speak about the Jewish Museum of Bosnia and Herzegovina. It's located in Sarajevo, as we said before. Obviously, it preserves and showcases the history, culture, heritage of the Jewish community of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and obviously housing the oldest synagogue in the country, built in 1581. The museum's permanent exhibits chronicles over 400 years of Jewish life in Bosnia, including artifacts such as religious ones, manuscripts, photographs, traditional clothing, collection features, items from the Ottoman period through Austro-Hungarian era, World War II, and the post-war period. And notably, the museum houses a collection of Ladino and other Jewish books, some printed in over 200 and 300 years over here. So very, very interesting. Then there's Il Calgrand, which we did speak about before, which has been used as a cultural centre since 1946. We did mention that just about 15 minutes ago, if I'm not mistaken. Il Calgrand, so just look back over there. Then there's Zenica Synagogue. What is the Zenica Synagogue, friends, over here? It's a former Orthodox synagogue. existed in Zenica in Bosnia and Herzegovina between the year 1903 to 1941, and I think since 1968 the building has been used as a Jewish history museum and was listed as a national monument in 2013. Very, very interesting enough. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, by 1885 the community had built a synagogue next to a local bazaar and a Jewish cemetery outside the city. The current synagogue building was built between 1904 to 1907. In 1910, the Jewish community in Zenica was approximately 297 people, with about 200 living in the city on the eve of the invasion of Yugoslavia. 185 members of the Zenica Jewish community were killed in the Holocaust, and those who returned to their homes after the war were unable to rebuild the demolished synagogue building themselves. So I think the building will take on other roles. The Zenica Ironworks used the building to house their printing houses at that point in time. And in the 1960s, the building housed a furniture store. In 1968, the Jewish community of Yugoslavia reached an agreement with the city to turn the building into a local museum, which is very, very interesting enough. Now then there's a Jewish community of Doboj over here, which is another great place over there. In the city of Doboj in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The Jewish community of Doboj was founded in 1871 and still exists to this day. I think it was in the 1940s. There were 24 Jewish communities in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Sarajevo, Tuzla and Banja Luka all had both obviously Sephardic and Ashkenazic Jewish communities, while others had one joint community. I think today, in addition to the community in Doboj, there are 5 remaining communities. Obviously, we talked about this before. Sarajevo, Banja Luka, Zenica, Tuzla and Mostar, respectively, over there. Yes, so very, very interesting. The relationship with the local community, let's just say, briefly soured when there was someone named Mordechai at Ijas. The community's president at the time proclaimed himself as a Jewish Chetnik and helped expel Bosnian Muslims from the town. Over there, that's reported over here in Wikipedia. Many members of the community lived in Doboj or in surrounding towns, including in Teslik, Samak and Derivanta. If I'm not mistaken, there was a mission of the organization to preserve Jewish identity and traditions in Bosnia and Herzegovina, as well as promoting peace, culture, economic cooperation among all citizens of the country. The community, I think, gets funding from membership fees, the Jewish Social Fund, grants from the government ministries of the Republika Srpska and the city of Doboj, and donations. I think in 1997, the Jewish population in Doboj was about 19 individuals only. In 2005, there'll be more, there'll be 40 people. The synagogue in Doboj, the first synagogue in Doboj was built in 1874, was destroyed in 1972 during the Second World War. On the entrance floor, they survived the destruction, and that door stands in the courtyard of the new synagogue as a symbol of remembrance. The current synagogue was consecrated in 2003, with the community using a reconstructed family home from 1922 that originally belonged to Alexander Brodsky and Otto Kalama, if I'm not mistaken. And the community named the new synagogue Bet Shalom. The site includes a Jewish cultural center and headquarters of the Jewish community of Doboj, and was inaugurated in the year 2004. Then there's a Mostar synagogue. Let's talk about that for a minute. It's a significant location in Bosnia and Herzegovina's Jewish history. Serves the local Jewish community's house of worship for several decades, and it's become a cultural, let's say, center which functions today. And I think talking about Mostar here dates back around 1570. The community in of itself does, and when Sephardic Jews would take refuge over there due to the Alhambra decree. And we talked about how the community will evolve as the years go on. There was population growths, and what's interesting, due to a population growth and insufficient size of the former synagogue, the committee for building a new one was established. Its members were David Kohn, David Frommer, and L. Rosenfield. The cost of a project, let's just say, was estimated at 17,500 KR, and there was sufficient funds were not acquired, however, so the committee was left in a 9,000 KR debt and had to reach out to the governing body of Bosnia for help. I think the current synagogue building was built in 1904, and with it being, I think, roughly 20 by 11 meters in size and 70 centimeter thick walls, it would sadly get heavy damage during the Second World War, if I'm not mistaken. and Jewish community of Mostar was not able to pay for its renovation. So it was decided to give it to the city, which decided to turn it into a puppet theatre, which will receive numerous awards during its existence. That's something we had to point out over there. Even now it's a very, very small community nowadays, but there have been apparently in recent times talks of new synagogue being built since the late 1990s, as community hasn't had one since 1952 apparently. So I'm not too sure the demographic. I'm just reading this from Wikipedia. Then it's the Ari Living Jewish Cultural Center. What is this? I think it's in Banja Luka, as we mentioned about before. It was inaugurated in 2014, and it's only such a facility built after the Second World War in the Balkans. I think it's used, this culture center, as let's say affirmation of Jewish culture, history, tradition. There's a religious center, the Ilona Weiss Synagogue, as well as shops, coffee bars, and private spaces. It was the synagogue is part of the Jewish Culture Center, and it's named after Ari Levin Ilona Weiss, who during the Second World War was murdered in Auschwitz. This is one of the two synagogues in territory of the Republic of Srpska, and other being located in Doboj. The first days of Israel and Jewish culture were organized at the Ari Levin Jewish Cultural Center in 2005. Now, the Jewish Culture Center is named after Ari Levin, who was a friend of the Republika Srpska's president Milorad Dodik, who named him as representative of the Republika Srpska in Israel. And I think it was in 2017, it was revealed that the office is registered as a private company in Israel, despite having received nearly 1 million Bosnian marks in public subsidies. Levin was later declared as a person non grata in Israel, and Dodik, at that point in time, threatened to cut off relations between Republika Srpska and Israel because of this. Very, very interestingly enough. Now let's speak about more the rabbis again that will really shape Bosnia, the Yugoslavia. One rabbi we must speak about over here is Rabbi Dr. Isaac Alkalai. Rabbi we've spoken about on various occasions before. To give him his full title, Rabbi Dr. Isaac Abraham Alkalai. He was born in 1881. He passed away in 1978. He was nearly 100 years old. He was actually born in Bulgaria. He would serve as a chief rabbi of Yugoslavia and Serbia, and later on he was the main American rabbi of Sephardic Jews. He was born in Sofia in Bulgaria. He was the son of Rabbi Abraham Alkalai and Rabbanette Rivka Arditi, I believe. Very, very interesting enough. He studied in the Vienna Rabbinical Seminary and graduated, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, from the University of Vienna in 1908. In 1909, he was appointed the chief rabbi of Belgrade and of Serbia. He served as an emissary of the Serbian government between 1915 to 1918, visited America on a mission in 1918 on behalf of the Serbian Jews, and wrote about the Serbian Jews in the American Jewish Yearbook. He founded a rabbinical federation of Yugoslavia in 1923, serving as its president and helping edit its annual Jevreski Almanac. I think in 1923, King Alexander I appointed him the chief rabbi of Yugoslavia. He would attend the first Sephardic Congress in 1925. It's reported over. Very interesting. So you can see he was very, very busy. He was elected vice president of the World Sephardic Foundation, and I think in the years prior to the Holocaust, he was central in the unifying figure for the Yugoslav Jewry. In 1928, he published a study of Jews through the Balkans, and I think it was in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, he would receive the Order of St. Sava in 1921. In 1932, King Alexander I appointed him to the Senate of Yugoslavia, if I'm not mistaken, making him the only Jewish member of the Parliament of Yugoslavia. He wasn't reappointed in 1938. Obviously, there was anti-Semitic sentiments were rising in Yugoslavia due to, let's say, funding from the terrible Nazis at that point in time. He was a chaplain of the Serbian army during Balkan Wars, and at one point he was the president of the Yugoslavian Red Cross. He would also write several research studies on the history of the Jews of Serbia. I think it was in April 1941, the day after the Germans bombed Belgrade. Rabbi Alkalai left Belgrade with his wife and daughter and began escaping Yugoslavia by foot. There were false reports at the time he was killed in the bombings. Although his son-in-law was reportedly captured by Nazis, he was hunted by the Gestapo in Yugoslavia. And at one point, he hid in a cellar while his daughter told Gestapo agents that no one was in his house. The Breslau radio repeatedly singled him out for attack, promising listeners he would be captured. He managed to escape culture and made his way to Sofia, Bulgaria, only for pro-Nazi Bulgarian government at that point in time, under King Boris III, to find out about his arrival and order him to leave within 24 hours. He was also able to stay longer for health reasons, and later made his way to Istanbul, Turkey. From there he made his way to the land of Israel, where he was welcomed by the entire Yishuv for his support for Zionism and for being the great nephew of Rabbi Yehuda Alkalai, the famous rabbi that, let's say, preached, obviously we spoke about him yesterday, political Zionism decades before Theodor Herzl. While in Palestine, he recovered from his journey and made arrangements with the Jewish agency leaders, especially the heads of the Sephardic community, to render aid to Yugoslavia. He would travel to America on a roundabout journey, I think via West Africa and South America. He would arrive, I think, in July 1942, if I'm not mistaken, over there. So you can see he was very, very much, very well decorated and very well travelled also, we have to point out, over there. He would settle in New York City. He would make that prominent move, and to become a representative of the Yugoslav government in exile. In 1945, he helped organize the Central Sephardic Jewish Community of America, serving as its leader, the chief rabbi of all the Sephardic Jews in New York City, and spiritual head of all Sephardic communities in the United States. Until the leadership, the Sephardic community in America went from some scattered and stagnating congregations into a more unified and mainstream community that's involved in the founding of the World Jewish Congress. In 1936, he promoted its work on behalf of persecuted European Jewry before, during, and after the World War II and the Holocaust. He was a board member of the American Joint Distribution Committee, B'nai B'rith, and the New York Board of Rabbis. He would found a Sephardic home for the aged in Brooklyn. He retired as a chief rabbi in 1968, and which he lived in the Sephardic home. In 1970, Yeshiva University gave him a medal. In 1971, the Association of Yugoslav Jews in the US issued a souvenir journal in his honor of his 90th birthday. In 1910, Rabbi Alkalai married Rabbinit Jelena Schaefer in Vienna. They had one daughter named Naomi, who established a Chief Rabbi Dr. Isaac Abraham and Jelena Alkalai Chair in Sephardic Studies at Yeshiva University's Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies in 2009. Now, I think he died in the Sephardic home on December the 29th in the year 1878. Interesting enough. So, okay. There were schools the whole time. Let's explore that a little bit with regards to school structure here in Bosnia and Sarajevo in previous days. There was always schools over there, and there was a Jewish community that would send their children. I think they would. It's interesting. I think that they would. Most notably, the children in the schools would actually sit on mats in those days. It's actually reported over. It was mostly children in the younger schools was aged between 4 to 12, if I'm not mistaken. And a lot of what they would learn was actually that was based on memorizing things. And many of the classes was, let's just say, taught in Latin, Ladino, if I'm not mistaken. Students would learn half day in school, apparently, when we're talking back 1800s, 19th century time. The students were employed later on from the community. I think they would take apprentices on in of itself. And I think initially there was a lower education standard in this area compared to other places of Western European communities, if I'm not mistaken. There was, it's very, very interesting. Yeah. I think, so I think always there was school systems over there, and obviously the school structure in Bosnia would change, obviously, by the annexation of the city by Austro-Hungarian Empire, and I think they would teach mostly in Ladino and Hebrew, and the official language education system, I think, was Serbo-Croatian, which was established with the entry of the Austro-Hungarian authorities, which would accelerate, let's say, a process of development of the city's education system at that stage in time. Educated Jews from across the empire, let's just say, would very much immigrate to the city, I think, of Sarajevo, and at that point in time, they will contribute to the development of academic education. Sarajevo's, let's just say, opening to Europe facilitated integration of its residents into European education system, and members of wealthy families went to pursue higher education at leading universities. These were Bosnian people, and we very much have seen this before. At that point in time, there was, because of the increased amount of educated people, especially people go all over Europe with academic credentials at that point in time, there was Zionists and non-Zionists as well. There were various Zionistic communities that would actually bear fruit. It would lead to unification at that point in time of communal and cultural activity, which is very, very important. And there were different streams of Zionism also in Bosnia, which we have to point out. And very, very interesting. But that's a whole topic. So we're going to speak about the Jewish Theological Seminary of Sarajevo in due course. I think it was headed by Rabbi Dr. Moritz Levy. Interesting enough, but we'll speak about that towards the end of this presentation. And as we said before, the Jewish community of Sarajevo, original rabbi was Rabbi Shmuel Baruch. I think it was of Saloniki, if I'm not mistaken. He was actually appointed the chief rabbi in the year 1623. And I think it's actually considered the first rabbi to be permanently appointed by the Sephardic community over there. And I think there was other famous rabbis like Rav Asher Zvulun, Rav Matzliach Mojujon, and Rav Shmuel, like Rav Shmuel Baruch in of itself. And I think there was correspondence with other rabbis. Remember, we spoke with Rabbi Tzvi Ashkenazi. I think it was in first class. We did mention him, if I'm not mistaken. And another key rabbi in the history of Sarajevo was someone named Rabbi Yosef Majuro, and I think he was appointed the chief rabbi. I think it was either before or after Rabbi David Pardo was, who we mentioned about also in the first class in of itself. I think a lot of these positions as chief rabbi would also be coupled with a head of Jewish courts position, I think in some cases, if I'm not mistaken. Also, obviously we mentioned about Rabbi Moshe Danon in the previous class in of itself, and what actually occurred during his time period. And always, I think there was the Ottoman authorities would, I think in many cases, would include the title of a Chacham Bashi, if I'm not mistaken. I think there was another rabbi, Rabbi Moshe Pereira, who received a title in 1840 or to 1852, if I'm not mistaken, and as rabbi of the Ottoman, given a specific title in himself. Now we're going to speak about we spoke about Rabbi Avram Romano yesterday, Rabbi Dr. Moritz Levy we spoke about yesterday, and so on and so forth. So that's something that we'll have to point out over here. And we did also talk about how Rabbi Bernard Buchwald would be appointed the first Ashkenazic chief rabbi at the time period of the Austro-Hungarian Empire of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and how there was budgeted activities, institutions at that point in time, and within the community, and how, let's just say, Bosnia itself would change and will evolve in that window in time. So we're going to speak about the Theological Seminary of Sarajevo in due course. We're going to speak about more famous historians of yesteryear. So we're just getting back in 1 minute, friends. So just watch your space, and we're going to speak about Rabbi Moshe Danon. So just hold on a minute, and we'll be back in 1 minute, friends. Over. Hi, shalom everyone. Thanks for being patient. Let's continue this video over here of the history of the Bosnian and Bosnia and Herzegovina Jewish community history. So welcome anyone if you are new to the channel. Let's speak about another great, let's say, a historian, very famous Bosnian figure, someone named Moshe David Gaon. We've spoken about him on various occasions before inside the series. He was born in 1889. He passed away in 1958. He was a Bosnian born Israeli historian. He was a scholar of the Sephardic world. He was a bibliographer. He was an educator. And he was a journalist and a poet. He was one of the pioneers, let's just say, of Ladino culture in Israel, and the father of businessman Benny Gaon, and obviously Yehoram Gaon also. These are famous Israeli figures. Let's explore about his life. He was born in Travnik in Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1889 on the 6th of September. He died, he was nearly 70 years of age. He was 69. He died in Jerusalem in October the 8th, 1958. He was buried in Har Menuchot. Very interesting enough, he had a very broad education in various different yeshivot. He would learn also in David Yellin College of Education, I believe a place we visited before here on this channel, which I have to point out. Okay, he was born in Travnik, as we mentioned before. His father was Hacham David Gaon and Rabbanit Rivka Gaon, if I'm not mistaken. And they were sages, came from sages of the famous Yeshivat Porat Yosef and Yeshivat Bet El, two of the bastion of the Sephardic Yeshivot in the old city of Jerusalem. His family, I think, descends from Spanish expellees to the Balkan region following the Inquisition. In his youth, he studied at both Talmudic and public schools. When he was 18 years of age, he would go to Vienna. He would continue his studies, would end up joining an academic association with other Balkan immigrants. Near the end of the First World War, he emigrated to Israel. He served 1 year in the Ottoman army in Beersheba and later studied at Ezra Teachers Seminary. At the outbreak of the War of Languages, he would join the strikers, reported over, and completed his studies at the seminar Beit HaKerem under the guidance of David Yellin, a place we visited about before, and we recorded a tour of Beit Kerem not longer, I think about 6 months ago, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe 8 months ago, which I recommend everyone to watch. I think it was in 1921 he would visit the newly formed Yugoslavia. He returned to Jerusalem with his parents. He became the director of the Talmud Torah in Izmir and published a Hebrew language magazine called Hevranu to help his students learn. I think he would return to Israel. He would hold various positions in offices of Zionistic movements, managements in Jerusalem. He was one of the members of Hapoel. There was a Hapoel Sa'ir party. I'm not too sure if that's the name of the party. So until its merger with the Ahadot Ha'avodah in 1930, he would serve as a reporter for a number of international Ladino newspapers, including the Second Avenir and the La Lepoka in Saloniki, Hashofar in Plovdiv, and the Il Judea in Constantinople. Later in his career, he would write articles for Harut, if I'm not mistaken. He was a first teacher of the children of the Motzah. The classroom was located in the old Motzah synagogue. He would spend time in Motzah during the week for teaching and return on Shabbat to Jerusalem. I think he would teach there 4 years. He would travel to Buenos Aires in 1928. He helped edit the Hebrew Stage and served as a teacher at the Moroccan Jewish community, a school in the city. He returned the following year to Israel and was invited to serve as a general secretary of the Sephardic Community Council in Jerusalem, which he held until he passed away in 1958. He did huge amounts of activities, roles, as we say, of the Histadrut HaSephardim, later Sephardim and Oriental communities, and then in the World Sephardi Federation as a member of the board. He was known as a Talmid Chacham and a multidisciplinary. I'm just reading this from Wikipedia. And his main discipline was the study of Oriental Jewry in the land of Israel and in diaspora. His many public studies, which form the basis of the study of the history of the Jews of Spain. Let's just say it's known as his book, The Jews of the East in the Land of Israel, Past and Present. It was in 2 volumes, which was published in 1928. He would write various poems in Ladino and collected many Ladino newspapers, writing a bibliography on the Ladino press. From his inclination to study the newspapers of the Orient, he published many bibliographical articles on the subject in collections on the history of Palestine press. It's by David Yudelowitz and Zalman Pevsner, if I'm not mistaken, over there. That's very, very interesting within regards to him. Okay, he got married to Sarah Benjamin Hakim, was a native of Izmir, if I'm not mistaken. They would have reported over 2 They would have 4 children, 2 daughters, Khalil and Igal, and 2 sons, the famous businessman Beni Gaon and Yehoram Gaon, if I'm not mistaken. And he's buried in Har Menachot. He was passed away on the 8th of October in 1958. And Moshe David Gaon would have various different commemorations, notable ones. Especially, there's a street named after him in Makor Baruch neighborhood in northwest Jerusalem. Somewhat I think we've visited on this channel before. His son Benny would found the Moshe David Gaon Center for Ladino Culture in his name at the Ben Gurion University of the Negev, and his personal archive is preserved at the National Library of Israel. We recorded, I think, 2 videos within regards to him, one about his book and one within regards to him. Another key figure in Bosnia was someone named Kalmi Baruch. Who was he? He lived between 1896 and 1945. He was a Bosnian scholar in the field of Ladino. He was a pioneer of Sephardic studies and Hispanic studies in the former kingdom of Yugoslavia. So who was he? So he was born in December 1896 in Sarajevo to one of the oldest Sephardic families in Bosnia and Herzegovina. He would attend elementary school in Visegrad and graduated from high school in Sarajevo. His academic studies was a PhD thesis, Der Lustand dis Justempan Shen in Bosnia, if I'm not mistaken. And I think he was connected to Vienna University also. He worked as a teacher at the first Sarajevo Gymnasium. And he was, I believe, at that point in time, he was the only Balkan Peninsula scholarship recipient from the Spanish government for the postdoctoral studies in the Spanish Center for Historical Studies in Madrid. I think this was around in 1928. For many years, I think he worked together with several Yugoslav and European magazines in the field of linguistics and literature. He collaborated with Gadret, the Institute for Balkan Studies, the University of Belgrade, and the Royal Spanish Academy. He translated, reported over from Spanish to Serbo-Croatian, different works also. He presented, let us say, some of the lesser-known Spanish literature in Yugoslavia and reviewed it. He published linguistics, comparative studies, let us say, school books, scientific works on philosophy, reviews, especially in Romance languages. He collected, annotated, and explored Judeo-Spanish linguistic forms, and very, very interesting enough. Many different books in of itself. And he cooperated, I think, with various other people. I think possibly Rabbi Dr. Moritz Levy, Laura Papo Bohoreto, who we mentioned about in the last class, Ernesto Jimenez Caballero, Ivo Andrik, Isidora Sekulik, Zako Fina, Stanislav Vinava, very famous people they happen to be in. Now, it's interesting enough, he spoke 10 languages, and he wrote his works primarily in Serbo, Croatian, and Ladino, in Spanish, French, and German. And I think during the 1930s he was eminent. He was, let's say, more left-oriented Yugoslav intellectual. He gave special attention to pupils of poor social background, workers' education, religious tolerance, and fought against anti-Semitism. And another notable thing within regards to him, he propagated unreserved support for the Republicans during the Spanish Civil War. He died sadly in a Nazi concentration camp called Bergen-Belsen. Very, very sadly, you can see he wrote many, let's say, popular works of his point in time, had big bibliography, and there's comprehensive international bibliographies that deal with Ladino culture, especially with the Judeo-Spanish language. They include Kalmi Baruch's bibliography, if I'm not mistaken. I think especially in the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, they translated his Spanish ballads, if I'm not mistaken, and as I mentioned before, he cooperated and collaborated with many other famous people at that point in time. Another key rabbi, let's just say, in the Yugoslav areas, also was connected very much to Bosnia, was someone, Rabbi Hinko Orbach, who was a chief rabbi of Zagreb in Croatia. Interesting enough, he was born in 1872 in Moravka. He died in Paris in France in the year 1960, if I'm not mistaken. His wife was Rabbanit Sarah in the Feldman family, if I'm not mistaken. He was born in Czech Republic in 1872. And I think we learned in Cheder. He was sent to Cheder in Keski Tessin. He was educated by the Khatam Sofer's Yeshiva in Bratislava, if I'm not mistaken. He would, in 1898, he would learn in the rabbinical school in Budapest, if I'm not mistaken. He would study comparative philology of Semitic languages, and he would graduate in 1904. I think we did speak about it in a previous class, if I'm not mistaken. In 1928, when I think the Rabbi Samuel Vessel had passed away, he was Ashkenazic chief rabbi of Sarajevo. Rabbi Orbach was appointed his successor. During World War II, Rabbi Orbach and his family found refuge in Italy, and they moved to Lucerne in Switzerland. His valuable library was seized by the Nazis and taken to Berlin for future museum and extinct race. After the war, Rabbi Orbach returned to Sarajevo. In 1946, he moved to Zagreb, and over there he was appointed, I believe, the chief rabbi of Zagreb. Later make Aliyah with his wife in Israel, and he died in 1960 in Paris at his son's apartment. Very, very interesting. I think other key rabbis, was a rabbi that was very prominent, I think, if I'm not mistaken, maybe in the 1970s. I'll have to double check about him. Rabbi Morris al-Bahari, if I'm not mistaken. He was a prominent Serbian Jew and a Holocaust survivor. I think he was a rabbi also. Actually, I'm not too sure if he was a rabbi or not, but he was. There's actually an interesting article about him. Just states some information. How he was born in 1930, in October 1930, in Sanski Most. It was Kingdom of Yugoslavia. His father was David al-Bahari, and I think he had 3 older sisters, if I'm not mistaken. His family settled in Drvar, and I think Morik's father owned a successful dry goods business, and they were the only Jewish family, I think, in Drvar, respectively. But they had like a great cultural and religious affiliation. They attended the synagogue, I think, in Skanski Most, which had a large, the area itself had a large Jewish population, it's reported over. Many extended members of this family were living in the kingdom, and the Alboris would spend holidays and other celebrations. It was a very well-known Sephardic family history they had, which went several centuries. And obviously they escaped, I think, the Spanish Inquisition. And they had traditions using various different languages: Ladino, Spanish, Hebrew, Arabic, Turkish, Aramaic, Greek, French, Bulgarian, Italian. And it was developed, obviously, during their time period, during the Sephardic exodus at that point in time. I think Morik was known as a very energetic, bright person. He fought in the World War I, if I'm not mistaken, or World War II, I'm not too sure. His father fought in World War I for the Austro-Hungarian Empire against Serbia at that point in time, and would give his son, Morik, military magazines. Morik would read them. He rode his bicycle around Prague. I think during World War I, David al-Bahari fought against, I think there was family members that were fighting for Serbia at that one time, reported over. I think it was in the 1930s, it was a fascist organization known as the Ustabsha. They began to insert ultra-nationalistic views in the region. And as the Nazis began to invade countries in Europe, the group allied itself with terrible Hitler and Mussolini. And in April 1941, Germany invaded Yugoslavia and quickly toppled the government by April 17th and installed the Ustasha as its puppet government and took control of what it called the independent state of Croatia and parts of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The racial policies aligned with those of the Nazis. I think they forbade Jews, Orthodox Christian Serbs and Roma to participate as full citizens of the former kingdom, and they terrorized the groups. I think there was bands of Ustasha. They rode the areas they controlled, unfortunately murdered their targets, the groups, and sent hundreds of thousands to concentration camps, which brings a tear to the eye to read about this. I think the Ustasha took over Drvar until Hitler annexed a small city to the Italians, who were part of the Axis at the time. Now, this Morik, who we're speaking about now, was expelled from school for being Jewish. You can see the anti-Semitism there was over there. He couldn't understand it. He asked his father why he was being accused of killing Yoshka, as also known as Jesus. In fact, he asked him, who was this Yoshka Jesus? And why anyone would believe that he or the Jews killed him. I think the al-Bahari store was taken over by the Ustasha, who forced Morik's father to give them most of the profits. They raided the shelves and routinely threatened Morik's family. In June 1941, the al-Bahari family was arrested and sent to a collection camp where they joined 150 Jews from the city in Bihak. The camp was surrounded by barbed wire and living conditions were poor. I think the threat of murder and rape hung over the victims' heads. Some of the prisoners were victims of the Ustasha's cruelty. And I think it was after 3 months in the camp, the prisoners were sent by truck to a nearby city and then transferred to a cattle car bound for death in Jesenovac. And I think statistics have been I think various statistics were buried and revisionism abounds in many sections of Croatia today. Jasenovac and the other camps in its system carried out, I think, murders of up to 340,000 Serbs, 30,000 Jews, and 25,000 Roma, if I'm not mistaken. At that point in time, Morik was 11 years old, and with the aid of former music teacher who was a Eustacia Shoulder, he escaped and transported to Jasenovac, leaving behind his parents and his sister Judita. He was placed in the care of an Italian colonel who the teacher knew. He lived with a Serb family back in Drvar under an assumed Serb name. Morik was protected from harm. As the Germans approached Drvar 2 months later, the colonel who helped Morik could no longer protect him. The young boy escaped to the mountains of Bosnia and survived for several weeks until being discovered by Josip Broz Tito partisans. Until the end of the war in May 1945, Morik stayed with the partisans and was trained to be a courier and a photographer. As an adolescent, he faced harrowing events that no one, especially a child, should endure. He hid his identity from the comrades for fear of reprisals for being a Jew. As a boy, he had to face mortality to fulfill his mission to deliver messages as a courier to other fighting units, often during ever-present danger. He knew that if the enemy caught him, they would torture and kill him. I think there was an interview for the acclaimed documentary about Ladino called Saved by Language, where Morik would actually tell of encountering 5 American and British pilots, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. But I think all throughout his life he was actually very much affected with it. After the war, Morik changed his name to Morris to regain control over his life. He would later be referred to as Uncle Moko by many, and he left a profound legacy in both the now, let's say, in the very dwindling Sephardic community in Bosnia and the community at large. Various life experiences during the war informed his post-war life in Sarajevo. He would live out his years as a pilot trainer, a director of the new international airport in Sarajevo, and a humanitarian. He lived a life full of incredible achievements. He married his wife, Ella, in 1961. He had one son, David, or Dado, in 1964. Apparently, Dado lives with his wife, Natasha, in Croatia, and Ella remains a long-time resident in Sarajevo. I think Morris passed away in October 2022, if I'm not mistaken. So he would have been maybe 92 years of age. Yeah, he was a key figure in Bosnia and with a very, very interesting story. He really, really suffered. Now, a prominent figure in Bosnia and Herzegovina, current day, a president, I think since 1995, is someone named Jacob Finke. He's also a Bosnian politician and an ambassador and the current president of the Jewish community of Bosnia and Herzegovina. He was born to a Sephardic Jewish family on the 1st of October 1943. During the Second World War time period. He's a lawyer by profession. He became a member of the presidency of the Jewish community in Sarajevo in 1990. He worked in humanitarian activities during the war in Sarajevo. In 1995, Finke was elected president of the Jewish community of Bosnia and Herzegovina. He's a founding member and the current president of the Inter-Religious Council of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which was established in 1997. Its membership, let's say, reflects the country's Islamic, Christian and Jewish communities. He's also the president of the Constitutional Commission of the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, director of civil service, interesting enough, as agents of Bosnia and Herzegovina, as well as ambassador to Switzerland and non-residential ambassador of Liechtenstein. He's a respectable public figure. He was elected, I think, in the year 2000, if I'm not mistaken, to chair the National Committee charged with the establishment of a Truth Reconciliation Commission. 2 years later, he was appointed director of the Civil Service Agency of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And because his political ambitions were thwarted when he learned that being Jewish, he was unable to run for president, apparently. Under the Dayton Peace Agreement that ended the war in Bosnia, I think in 1995, December 1995, membership to the parliament's upper house of presidency was reserved for one of 3 ethnic groups: Bosniaks, Croats and Serbians. Minorities or others outside the constituent groups, such as Jews and Roma, can be members of the parliament but may not stand for high political office. Jacob Finke and Derval Sijka, who was a prominent Bosnian Roma and a member of Bosnia's Roma Council, appealed to the European Court of Human Rights, argued that Bosnia's constitution violates the European Convention on Human Rights, apparently, and the judgment was handed down in favour in September 2009. The court found that certain provisions of the Bosnian constitution and election law discriminate against minority groups. However, 6 years after the ruling, the judgment had not been implemented yet by Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is very, very interesting. He would receive many decorated honors and awards. Jacob Finke was decorated various times. These honors include the Grand Cross of the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany, as well as the American Decoration, First American Freedom in Richmond, Virginia. He was named a Chevalier de la Légion d'Honneur of the French Republic in 2009, and he was proclaimed Person of the Year by Sarajevo's daily newspaper, San, and Man of Year for 2013 by the Bosnian daily The Konichi List. He received International Primo Levi Prize in 2003 in Genoa in Italy. Interesting now. Now there was other key people. We spoke about Ivan Kersniges. I think he was a key figure. He was a president, if I'm not mistaken, between 1992 to 1996, which was coincided, let's just say, with the siege of Sarajevo. He was instrumental in organizing the evacuation of Jews from the city and the restoration of the Jewish sites, which included the old Jewish cemetery over there at that point in time. And he would very much give over some wartime leadership. Let's speak about Rabbi Shmuel Vassell now over here. He was a chief rabbi also of Bosnia, the Ashkenazic chief rabbi at one point in time. If I'm not mistaken, I think he was born in 1871 and he died in 1928 on the 12th of April in Yugoslavia in of itself. He was a chief rabbi of the Ashkenazi community of Sarajevo, which was a very prominent position during the earlier part of 1923. He was born in Vats, if I'm not mistaken, which was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He died in Dubrovnik, which was part of Yugoslavia at that point in time. So very interesting. He would learn in the University of Bern, Yeshiva Frashburg, University of Lincoln, if I'm not mistaken. So he was very well travelled in of itself, and was chief rabbi of the Ashkenazic Jewish community of Sarajevo. Let's explore about him. He would learn in Yeshivat in Freshburg, in Bratislava, if I'm not mistaken. He'll be ordained as a rabbi over there, and would get a Teuda in of itself. Over there at that point in time, he was a philosopher. He would study that, and he would get doctorate, I believe, also. Very interesting enough. I think he would go to Hamburg, München, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe possibly also to Vienna also. And in 1898, December Berlin, et Sifro, Targum, Shasak, Urim, Le Megillat Ruth. He would actually write on the Megillat Ruth, which read on Shavuot. Beshnat so Kibel, Mesorot, Rabbanot, Bekila, Ashkenazit, Shel Sarajevo. I think he would. And in 1902, Monel Rabbit Knesset Ashkenazi Sarajevo, he would be appointed the rabbi of the synagogue, the Ashkenazi community in Sarajevo. Nihel Bo'et Hatfilot. I think in 1909, Monet Rashmit Rav Ashkenazi Rashi Shel Sarajevo Rabbatai, named the Sephardic chief rabbi then. And Rav Vassell Haya Chaber Beit Din Harabani Elyon Shel Yehudit Sarajevo. He was part of the Jewish court over there, who katav shoret mamarim בעיתונות היהודית והכללית שעסקו בפילוסופיה ובצורת המוסר, עסק במחקר אודות הרמב"ם, he would investigate with regards to chronicles of Rambam, וכתב באנציקלופדיה היהודית, write a form of encyclopedia. כן היה חבר במועצות הרבנות הראשית של ממלכת יוגוסלביה וחבר הנהלות איחוד הקהילות היהודית ביוגוסלביה. So right, he was a historian, very much so also. I think he passed away. He was 56 years of age in 1928, and I think later on it would be Junker Orbach, Rabbi Junker Orbach, would take his place as the chief rabbi, Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Sarajevo, if I'm not mistaken. Now we're going to speak a bit about the rabbinical seminary in Sarajevo. I think the rabbinical seminary, we actually recorded a video about this. I think about 6 months ago, if I recollect. So I recommend everyone to watch that video. This rabbinical seminary would stand between the years 1928 to 1941, which will imbue rabbis, educators, kosher slaughterers, shochets, chazanim, and really, it was known as a flagship rabbinic place for the Jewish community of Yugoslavia in itself, and I think it was connected to a synagogue also there, if I'm not mistaken. And inside Sarajevo in of itself. So let's explore a bit within regards to it. I think it was founded on 16th of October in 1928, and it would cease to operate, possibly because of the Second World War and the terrible Nazis, on the 6th of April 1941. So it would stand for about 12 years. It was headed by Rabbi Dr. Moritz Levy, who we spoke about in yesterday's class, and it had achrayut from Misrad Adatot, Shel Mamlechet Yugoslavia, but all good to Kilot Yudit, so the Jewish community would also support it. And we're going to speak a bit more about it in the coming minutes, so just watch your space, and we're going to speak about it in a minute. I'm just going to take a short 1 minute break over here, so watch your space over here, friends. I'll be back in 1 minute.
Do you want to put a chair like over there? Because I can't block it.
You want me to move the chair over there for you? Do you want me to put it there for you, or? Yeah, sorry.
I don't know if you have that many people coming.
Yeah, well, you want to do that?
Toda or
The person, or? I'm just going to come up in 1 minute. I'm here for another 10 minutes.
But they're late. We have the tables and chairs, but where are you guys? Did they get you tight? Did you see Spock? Oh, here it is. Oh my God, where are you? There's Lori. Lori, you sit out. You sit here.
Hi, Shalom everyone. Thanks for being patient over here as we're exploring the Jewish community history of Bosnia and Herzegovina over here in this special edition. We're just speaking a bit about now the rabbinical seminary that there was in Sarajevo. So who were part of this, let's just say,
Hi, how are you?
and there were various different famous rabbis that were part of it in of itself. There was Rabbi Mordechai Tzvi Orbach, who we spoke about before, Rabbi Jakub Mastro, there was Rabbi Prano Folinets, Abram Papo, among them. We're just exploring a list of the people over here. There was someone named Albert Suzin, Yitzhak Israel also. They were very much part of it. So we're just going to read over, just using Wikipedia. It's very difficult to find information with regards to the seminary, especially online. התקופה האוסטריה-הונגרית הייתה תקופה של שינוי ופריחה בחיי הקהילת הספרדית בסרביה. It was a time period of this Austro-Hungarian rule of change for the Sarajevan Sephardic community. השינוי הוביל לעימות בין הדור הצעיר שבניו יצאו לימודים גבוהים בעיקר בוויאנה לבין הדור הוותיק והשמרני. Many people go to Vienna to get rabbinic education and so on and so forth. בתקופה קצרה של 3 עשורים התחולל שינוי מהותי בחיי הקהילת הספרדית שלא חל בכל תקופה הארוכה בת מאות השנים בה שלטו העות'מאנים בסרייגו. בתקופה העות'מאנית התבסס חינוך ילדי הקהילה על במלדרי למדו ילדים בגילי 4 עד 12 אשר ישבו על מחלצות בכיתות צפופות. הלימודים נוהלו בלדינו, it was taught in Ladino, והתבססו על שינות. לאחר חצי יום לימודים הועסקו התלמידים and they would learn half the dough, and then, as I said before, they would then go on to work in their trades. With some רמת השכלה בקרב ילדי הקהילה הייתה נמוכה לעומת קהילה מערב אירופה, וכמעט לא אפשרה ללומדים לרכוש השכלה גבוהה. I think in 1910 הופכו המלמדרים למשרד החינוך האוסטרי-הונגרי ולתוכנית הלימוד הוכנסו כללים בנוסף לתוכנית הדת. שובם לעיר של רבנים מקרב הקהילה שרכשו השכלה בבית המדרש לרבנים ביינה. And I think at that point in time, כגון מוריץ לוי, יעקב מסטרו, הורה טלטלה מסד הרבני והובילו לחלפי דורות גם בתוכה. There was one at that point in time. In 1913, עזב את סרייבו, הרב אברהם מרקדו רומונו, who we spoke about in yesterday's class, מראשי המסד הרבני הישן, ועלה לארץ ישראל. I think it was in 1917, it says there. Rabbi Dr. Moritz Levy was appointed chief rabbi of the Jewish community of Sarajevo. Rabbi Levy סיים את בית מדרש רבנים בוויאנה. He actually finished learning in the Vienna Rabbinical Seminary. ורחש תואר doctor. He would get a doctorate in the University of Vienna. לאחר תום מלחמת העולם הראשונה, there was the First World War finished, וכינון ממלכות הסרייבו, הקרואטים והסלבונים עברו יהודי יוגוסלביה תהליך חינון מהם לא הייתה מערכת השכלה גבוהה בתחומי יהודית לצעירי הקהילה, פנו בהמוניהם להשכלה כללית. כן היה חוסר במערכה להכשרת בעלי תפקידים קהילתיים כגון חזנים. אומרים, there was a lack, I think, of חזנים, cantors, educators, Jewish educators, בכלל זה מחוסר בספרי לימוד. הקהילות השונות נאלצו לפנות לבעלי תפקידים מחוץ ליוגוסלביה, ואלו העוסקות בעליות גבוהות מאוד. I think it was in 1921. הוקמו סרייבו עמותת דגל התורה, ובה למדו בחברותו צעירים משכילים מקרא הקהילה, והיא נתמכה כלכלית על ידה. I think it was in 1923. הגישו דוקטור מוריץ לוי וחברי העמותה לאגוד הקהילות היהודית ביוגוסלביה הצעה להקים סמינר טכנולוגי בעיר, או תיאולוגי בעיר, שקיבל תלמידים מכל רחבי יוגוסלביה. They would make this theological rabbinic seminary at that point in time. I think over there, the goal of this ceremony was to produce rabbonim, chazanim, shochet, kosher sorters, umanem makom rab. הוצאה תוכנית 4 שנתית שכללה תוכנית לימוד אוניברסיטיים בלימודי יהדות. הצעה אושרה והוקמה בעדות לבחינת יישום הצעה. I think it was 16th of October 1928, נפתח הסמינר, would open the seminar at that time. בכל מחזור למדו 20 תלמידים. There were 20 students. המחזור הראשון היה 4 שנתי, והחל מהמחזור השני הייתה תוכנית הלימוד 5 שנתית בכללה שנת התמחות בתפקידים הקהיליים השונים בהסמכה לתפקיד. אף מוסד אחר ביוגוסלביה לא הציעו תוכנית יהודית מתקדמים כמו הסמינר בסרייבו. And then it goes on over here to say. הסמינר שכן במבנה המקום ברחוב סמלושה בסרייבו, המבנה כלל כיתות לימוד ופנימיה בת מספר חדרים. בקומה הראשונה שכן בית הכנסת, there was a big knesset inside the seminary, שפעל במקום קודם לכן וסופח לסמינר כחלקו ממנו. מתחת לבית הכנסת במרתף שכן אולם ספורט, there was a sports hall over there, של תנועת הנוער בר כוכבא, connected to that. ובין התקיימו שיעורי החינוך הגופני בסמינר. המתקן פעל עד אפריל 1941. It was open until April 1941. עת נכבשה יוגוסלביה על ידי גרמניה הנאצית. The Nazis unfortunately invaded, and that will spell the end, let's just say, of this rabbinical seminary. And so let's just talk about like what was curriculum like over there. התוכנית 4 שנתית כללה את תוכני הלימודים. עברית, they would learn עברית over there, Serbo-Croatian, גרמנית או צרפתית, they would learn Torah Nevi'im Ketuvim, the Tanakh, the Talmud, the Gemara, Kudkas, Shulchan Aruch, they would learn about the code of Jewish law, Midrashim, they would learn historia of Jewish community of Israel, pedagogia, geography, historical aids, general history, chinuch gufni, education, music, chazanut, to become a cantor. So it was very broad education in of itself, this rabbinate position. Hatfilah u'perkei chazanot nilmadu b'nusach Sfardit. They would learn it, and b'nusach Ashkenaz, they would learn both nusachs of tefillah. הסמינר היה תחת פיקוח של המשרד לענייני דתות של ממלכת יוגוסלביה. So it was connected to the Yugoslavian government. ותוקצב על ידי ממשלת יוגוסלביה בתקציב שנתי של 20,000 דינרים יוגוסלביים. I think we would have in that point in time. That was the budget. וכן על ידי אגוד הקהילת היהודית. I think general agudat of the Jewish community there would actually help also. ניתנה גם תמיכה אישית של קהילת ספריות באמצעות מלגות לימודים לתלמידים בני הקהילה. Locator Mossad, Mona, Dr. I think the main Rosh was Dr. Moritz Levy over there. Asher limed gam historia shel Am Yisrael b'Nevi'im. We teach the Nevi'im itself and the history of the Jewish communities. And it had various, I think, if I'm not mistaken, other rabbis connected to it, including Rabbi Dr. Unke Orbach, if I'm not mistaken, who would shlimed Tanakh b'Kod Kos Shulchan Aruch, Yaakov Mostra, who was known as a Moret, if I'm not mistaken. There was a Boger Beit Midrash Rabbanim, Vienna, Shlimed Brit, Tanakh. There was Dr. Franjo Fornens, if I'm not mistaken, or Franjo Poljanek, if I'm not mistaken, who would also over there teach, I think maybe in Serbo-Croatian language. There was Dr. Avram Papo, with Shlimed Germanit, and Dr. Albert Suzin, who made musica over there, interesting enough. People from outside of Sarajevo come to stay inside the seminary, but Talmidim Sarajevo, it's Garuba Batem Ba'ir, Machzor Harishon, I think between 1928 to 1930, Lamdu Talmidim Sarajevo, they come from Belgrade, from Bitula, I think Macedonia, Travnik, a Split in Croatia, from Sochog, Subotica, Satra, and also Pazova, if I'm not mistaken, very same place. Bein Talmidei Machzor Zeh Nitan Lamnot et Rab Professor Salmon Gaon, the famous Rabbi Solomon Gaon would land there. Limim Maratzah Yeshiva University, Moshe Kosola, interesting enough, he would also be there. Liyamim Harav Rashi Shel Toulouse, if I'm not mistaken, we spoke about him before inside the series. And Machzor Sheni from 1930 to 1937. I think there was Chamesh Nati, השנה האחרונה כללית התמחות בתפקידים השונים ומסגרתה בהוצאה גם סמיכה לרבנות או סמכו לראות. במחזור זה למדו תלמידים מסרייבו, בלגרד, נובי, פאזר, פרשלינה, ביטולה, קוטינה, סנטה, שפיט, וניקופסי, Zagreb, Split, various different places. I think even from Ethiopia, if I'm not mistaken, including Rav Tzadik Danon, he would be over there. And Rabbi Tzvi Elfgot, if I'm not mistaken. There was other people, Rabbi Mangetsto, his son Bato, if I'm not mistaken. And from the Beta Israel community, also Ethiopian, we have to point out. As we said before, this rabbinic seminary, unfortunately, will cease in 1941. There was a connection with the Beta Israel community. We have to point out over there, which we're going to speak. I will leave you all to investigate about that also, which is also another interesting tidbit over there. Yeah, more can be said about it. I think there was a Beit Knesset actually in this place in of itself. It says in 1900, Kiel Sarajevo, Rabbi Chazan, someone named Rabbi Abraham Kafon, if I'm not mistaken. וחולל שינוי בחיי הקהילה הספרדית. Kafon Hayat Lerab, he was a rabbi over there, Ba'al Haskala, בספורט בערבית ומוזיקה, בנוסף להשכלתו הרבנית. I think in 1903 he was appointed as a rabbi and a chazan of a Beit Knesset over there. It was opened in the central of the city. Rabbi Kafon ניהל את התפילות בסגנון הדומה לנולוגי. התפילות נוהלים כדיאלוג בין החזן למקהלה. קהל המתפללים נדרש להתפלל בשקט. המקום קונה בלדינו בלעג על ידי זקני הקהילה. קהל אילמים. בית הכנסת הפך, I think at some attractia לצערי קהילה, become an attraction point for the younger points of the Kehila in of itself. מספר שנים מאוחר יותר הגיע למקום הרב שבתאי גאון וכיהן כגבאי, שבתאי Ja'in, who would be appointed the Gabai over there, if I'm not mistaken, of the Beit Knesset. גם הרב Ja'in נקלע לעימות עם ראש קהילה הספרדית עד רקע גישותיו הליברלית. He was more on liberal side, so I don't think many people were too fond of him at that point in time. Very, very interesting. I think eventually Rabbi Mordechai Eltratz will become the rabbi of the Beit Knesset, if I'm not mistaken. So that's very interesting. Then it talks about לאחר הקמת הסמינר. לאחר הקמת הסמינר הפך בית הכנסת חלקי אינטגרלי ממנו. חלונות בית הכנסת פנו לסמטה פנימה ולא לרחוב הראשי. המבנה היה צנוע וכולל אולם תפילה. עזרת נשים אשר שקנה בצידו המזרחי באותו המפלס באולם התפילה על ידי מקץ עץ ארון הקודש שכן בצידו המערבי של החדר. בית כנסת נפתח לקהל מתפללים מחוץ לסגל המוסד ותלמידיו רב בחגי ישראל מועדיו during the Jewish festivals in המצב. באשר הימים שימש בית כנסת את תלמידי המוסד במהלך לימוד הדת והחזנות. They would learn within regards to chazanot also to become cantors, and during the Second World War I think it would stop being used if I'm not mistaken. Let's explore a bit within regards to Rabbi Tzaddik Danon, who was another famous rabbi. He lived between 1918 to 2005. He died on the 2nd of March 2005. Who was he? He was a chief rabbi of the Jewish community of Yugoslavia between 1972 to 1998. I think he learned inside this rabbinical seminary over here. He was born in Sarajevo, once again, in 1918. He died in Belgrade in 2005. He was about 86 years of age, if I'm not mistaken. He, once again, was part of this rabbinical seminary in Sarajevo. He was a graduate over there. And his rabbis included Rabbi Dr. Moritz Levy, and Rabbi Unik Orbach, also we have to point out. Who was he? He was born in Sarajevo. His father's name was Daniel, if I'm not mistaken. Netzel Rab Moshe Danon, if I'm not mistaken. Shikihen Krab Rashi Shel Yehudi Sarajevo B'Shanim 18. So I think he was connected to Rabbi Moshe Danon, who was a chief rabbi between 1815 to 1830. And we know that, we stated before, between 1932 to 1937, he would learn in the famous theological seminary in Sarajevo under Rabbi Moritz Levy. And he would receive a rabbinic ordination over there. He was appointed like an educator and instructor over there of the Kihilat Kosovosko Mitrovica Split. I think it connected to Croatia and Split and also Kosovo. But during the Second World War, Yugoslavia, הצטרף רב צדיק דנון לכוחות הפרטיזנים של טיטו. But I think in 1942 in April, נלכד בידי כוחות סבא להקים ונקלע במחנה מעצר באיטליה. רב דנון נמלט ממחנה המעצר והצטרף לכוחות המחתרת האיטליקית. מרבית בני משפחתו נוספו בשואת יהודי יוגוסלביה ורק שתיים מאחיותיו ניצלו. I think in 1947 he would return to Yugoslavia until 1950. He was appointed, I think, כיהן במספר משורות רבנות. I think in 1950 he would join, הצטרף לשירות הדיפלומטי היוגוסלביה. I think between 1953 to 1970 he was appointed a Rosh Machalket המדינת הנודרית. Between 1968 and 1970 he was appointed the Mamona al-Hisim Beshkirut Yugoslavia Beshveda. No, no, it's and 1972, let's say, after the separation of the Mishurut HaChutza Yugoslavia, he was appointed the chief rabbi of the Jewish community of Yugoslavia until 1998 for 26 years. I think Katab Mispar Sifrei Halacha, he wrote various books on Jewish law, if I'm not mistaken, on, very, very interesting enough. And he passed away in 2005 in Belgrade. He was 86 years of age. Bitor Daniela Danon, is part, very interesting. Also had a prominent role, if I'm not mistaken. So that's something that we very much have to point out over here. So friends, I think this is going to conclude that more we could have actually spoken about with regards to the Jewish community of Yugoslavia over here, but we tried to get a synopsis over here, as much of a synopsis as we could have. It was a 3-part series. We did also previously record a video on the synagogues and Jewish community of Yugoslavia, which you very much have to point out over here on the special edition over here, friends. Now friends, thanks very much for watching over here. Friends, we're a community over here. We are exploring the history of the rabbinate in various different countries all across the world. There's a special edition over here where we spoke about Yugoslavia, about Bosnia today. We completed the 3rd part series. We don't just record videos of the great countries of yesteryear, we also record videos on history of the great rabbis from yesteryear. Also, that's a project that we are working on at the moment, which is very, very important. So we've already recorded about 1,400 rabbis, we have to point out over here, and we recorded about 45 different countries inside the series, which is absolutely, as I say, staggering in of its own right in of itself, and really, really going from strength to strength at the moment. So, yeah, very, very interesting. And yeah, if you haven't subscribed yet to the channel, please subscribe and join our community at the moment, as we're really going from strength to strength over here, and really trying to explore more with regards to Jewish community histories from all over different places across the world. If anyone's interested in watching these videos, please share these videos with your friends to other people also. So I think on this note, wishing you all a fantastic day, and thanks very much. Appreciate everyone that is watching today and subscribe.